Hi everyone, and I am here for a discussion video on my experience of reading aloud the Little House on the Prairie books, the series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And it was a really interesting experience for me to kind of think and process as I was reading aloud this series that is definitely of its time and shows the pioneer experience in settler era America, late 1800s, and yeah, just what it was like for me to read aloud to my son. And I started this when he was 4, and then we just finished the last book that I'm reading to him as he's 5 and 5.5. So it's been a very interesting kind of just experience that I didn't realize I had a philosophy on reading aloud this kind of book until I did it myself. So the first book it was a very uncomplicated experience for me to read it aloud, and that is The Little House in the Big Woods. This is the very first book in the series, and it is just solely focused on Laura and her immediate family, and then a bit of her extended family. But it's very simple and pure in that it's just the experience of this family, and living in these isolated woods, and just they really are fairly rich in resources and just safety, and like I said, just they have a lot of food, and so there's not really much scarcity like you see later on in the series. And so it is very kind of the calm before the storm in the other books in the series, but there's really not much commentary that I felt like I didn't want to include for when I was reading it aloud. It was just a very easy breezy reading experience. Also, I think you could kind of whet a young child's appetite for the rest of the series by starting with this one and saying, when you're a little bigger, we'll read the other books, because the text in this book is very, very big. The font is very big, and there's a picture every 2 or 3 pages, and it's just such a delight. I adore this series so much. Flaws and all, I love this series. Then we move on to the next one, which is Farmer Boy. And for the life of me, I can't remember if I read this when I was younger. I don't know if I did, because it had the word boy in the title, which obviously I know women get really mad if men don't read, books with female protagonists just because it has a female protagonist, but then I did the reverse. So I had not read this, but this to me just lacked kind of the X factor that the rest of the series has, in that I feel really distant from Almanzo's parents. I should have said that this is, in case you haven't read this series, this is about her husband's upbringing in upstate New York on the farm that he grew up on. And so I don't feel nearly as much of a kinship to his parents as you do to Charles and Caroline Ingalls, Laura's parents. So I definitely enjoyed it. It was really interesting to see what his childhood was like. There were some really interesting, just fascinating anecdotes. And so that part was interesting, but I definitely was kind of ready to get back to the regular programming in the series and getting to follow the Ingalls family. So the first book in the series that I really felt like I felt honestly pretty stressed out while I was reading this aloud. So this is Little House on the Prairie. And in this installment in the book, the Ingalls family heads out to Kansas territory. And the Osage tribe were the tribe that would have been living in Kansas at the time. And there is so much kind of negative commentary about the Osage people, about how the fact that they're living in Kansas, when, you think about it for even a half second, you realize the Osage tribe was there first. And there's no discussion, there's no aspect of the discussion at all like, wow, these First Nations people were here first. Maybe we should even think about whether we should consider ourselves so entitled to the land like we're acting like we are. There's just not even a thought of that. And towards the end, there is a real possibility of going to war with the Osage tribe. And I actually ended up skipping those chapters because I feel like a lot of American history, you want to talk about with your children, you want to be really specific and intentional how you're talking about it. But I also feel like this topic deserves some nuance because there were some Native American tribes that were more violent, but obviously there were so many atrocities so many crimes that were committed towards Native American tribes. One thing, I'm not really, I would say I don't believe in censorship, but as I'm reading aloud to my son, I think, you know what, he's only 4 or he's only 5, so I am going to censor this some. So I think there are some topics that maybe when he's 8 or 9, I wouldn't censor this and then we'd have really in-depth discussions. But I feel like at 4 and 5, he's not able to have much nuance while he's reading this. The one thing that I really was intentional about while I read this, it refers to the tribes as Indian. And so I looked up specifically what Native American tribe would have been there at the time, and it was Osage. And so I just referred, anytime the word Indian was used, I actually just replaced it with Osage, because I think people can go a little overboard with, correcting language and, thought crime, all of that. But I do think this is a really easy, polite thing for us to do. So personally for myself, as I read it aloud, that was actually something that I changed. And I want to make it clear it's because of the age that he is. Am I opposed to listening to the audiobooks, reading the text as they are when he's older? Absolutely not. But I thought for the age that he's at, just so impressionable, I wanted to change that about this book. So actually later in the book, the chapters where there was the possible war between the settlers and the Osage tribe, I actually just skipped altogether because I felt like the way it's dealt with in this book, I didn't want to read it to my 4 or 5-year-old, however old he was when I read this. So that was kind of a stressful reading experience for me because I was constantly reading ahead. How am I going to address this? And then we get to what ended up being one of my favorites in the series, and I had just kind of glossed over the middle of the series in my memory of it, forgetting how enjoyable these next 2 books were. So On the Banks of Plum Creek, this was pretty easy breezy. There wasn't much in here that I felt the need to skip, and it was just so much fun. Now I say fun, but there are a lot of really dreadful things happening to the Ingalls family in this. And in this book, no, that's a spoiler, so I'm not going to say it. But there's just really, really hard things, whether it's financial difficulties or health struggles, all sorts of things that the Ingalls family is going through. But it's just the way that Laura Ingalls writes is so engaging, and it's so simple. I can't even tell you what about it is so marvelous, but I just know I had this compulsion to keep reading and wanting to know what would happen. As you keep reading, the illustrations become fewer and fewer. So I was kind of sad about that. I wish the illustrations, there were as many as were in Little House in the Big Woods. But there are still a fair number, and Garth Williams is the illustrator, and he also does the Cricket in Times Square illustrations. I love his style. It's just very simple, pen and ink. And let's see, where's one? So here is Pa working in the field. So just to see the Ingalls family's struggles and triumphs in this book. And then we move on to By the Shores of Silver Lake. And I think in this one, there wasn't much that I took out. I do know there is a lot of kind of passing negative commentary on Native Americans that I kind of would tweak or not even include. Because like I said, I just think for a 4 or 5-year-old, that's how I want to do it. Now, if I was talking to you in 5 years, it would be a different reading aloud experience. But for that purpose, just Ma talking about how she just doesn't like Native Americans. She just says flat out, like, I don't like them. And when Laura says why, she's like, I just don't. I don't know why. I don't. So things like that, I was just like, you know what? I'm fine excluding that from him. Not saying he can't read these when he's older, but that's what I wanted to do. So that was By the Shores of Silver Lake. I really enjoyed this one. It was so interesting to see kind of how they figured out where they were going to go next. And it was a really interesting time in our country for, trains becoming a really much more common form of transportation. And then we come to the long winter. And I think there really was not anything in here, I think, that I edited. The only thing that I changed was that there was, in the beginning, a Native American chief comes into the town of De Smet and warns them of the long winter. So I love that there was this really, kind of positive portrayal. And he warned them of the long winter coming. And it turns out they had a very long winter. So this one was just, I love this book. And it's interesting because all that happens in this book is that there's a big storm and they're stuck inside all winter, or there's multiple big storms. So it's surprising how interesting and riveting it is, but that just speaks to Laura Ingalls Wilder's skill as a writer. And then Little Town on the Prairie, there wasn't that much that I changed from this. There is, I can't believe, no, I did remember this. That's a lie. But I had temporarily forgotten. But then as it got closer, I remembered this chapter being in here. So they start to have a sort of talent show. I think they call it a literary circle or a literary club, where they each weekend in the winter when, everyone's cooped up, I think it's on Saturday nights, they all meet at the church. And they have kind of a sort of talent show that they do, and a variety show, and it's different each week. And there is a chapter where Pa and a bunch of other men in the town participate in a minstrel show, or blackface as it's called now. So I completely just left that chapter out. I just thought, you know what? There's no need for me to read this to him at this age. I don't want to include it. And I can still love this series and accept that it has flaws, and it's okay to read it like that. I'm at peace with skipping that chapter. And then the last one that I read aloud to him was These Happy Golden Years. And I don't think there was really anything that I decided to edit or take out of this one. I don't think. There may have been something, but nothing really is sticking out to me. I love this book. I forget how some of the stuff that's at the beginning is just so heartbreaking, and you feel so sorry for Laura, but it all ends up being okay in the end. And I just it's been such a joy to revisit this series. And then I actually have opted out of reading aloud to him the first 4 years, just because this is so sad and it doesn't feel the same at all as the other books. I think it was published after she died, after Laura Ingalls Wilder died. And yeah, it doesn't feel the same. I think it was taken from diary entries, and it's so short. And also the fact that it's not then followed up by, they actually had a lot of good years after this. And a really successful farm in the Ozarks. And so I don't have the heart to revisit this at this point. But yeah, so that's been kind of my experience. It was a lot more thought-provoking than it would be. What do you do with a series that, might have these viewpoints that you don't agree with now? But I think that something that happens then when people say, books are problematic, is kind of this viewpoint that now we have everything figured out in the modern day, and that people 100 years from now are not going to look at books written from this time period and not do exactly the same thing that we're doing to books now. You cannot judge books of the past by modern standards and just write them off completely. If there are things in here that are offensive, these books have still made a significant and lasting contribution, and they are a accurate portrayal of what pioneer life was like. We don't have pioneers anymore, and so these are books that we can look back and see what it was like. Then, we should also have literature showing experiences of Native Americans at this time, of African Americans at this time. I think that's all I have to say on this, so I hope it's not too controversial, and I hope I've put my thoughts across clearly, but I just wanted to talk about that briefly, what it's been like reading it aloud. So let me know down below kind of what your experience with these books has been and what you think, and I will be back for another video soon. Bye.